Liberty in our lifetimes in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. And we are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Airic Brakey, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Hey there, you porcupine, you. This is your host, your renegade statesman, Airic Brakey, executive director of the Free State Project, and welcome to episode 21 of the Porcupine Report. We got a great show for you today. I'm looking forward to telling you about our guest and welcoming him on. We'll be bringing him on in a moment. First, I want to let you know we're recording this well ahead of time due to scheduling things. By the time this episode is live, we're already in the middle of the Porcupine Freedom Festival. So I hope that you are there at PorcFest with us. But if you are not, if you are one of the unfortunate souls who is not in Lancaster, New Hampshire right now during this week, June 17th through the 23rd, perhaps you are one of those folks there and you're watching this show right now and the glow of your cell phone is filling your tent under the stars and the beautiful white mountains. But if you are one of the unfortunate souls who couldn't make it this year, I've got some good news. It's not the full PorcFest experience where you make friendships and build community that will last a lifetime, if not for generations, but you don't have to miss out completely on everything that's going on at PorcFest, because for just 29 Federal Reserve notes, you can sign up at porcfest.com/tickets for access to the week-long live stream of our main stage speakers, debates, and panels. So that includes Dr. Ron Paul, Spike Cohen, Dr. Naomi Wolf, Jack Hunter, Gene Epstein, Jeffrey Tucker, James Bovard, David Friedman, Martha Bueno, and so many more for only 29 Federal Reserve notes. This is an incredible value. We aren't even asking you for real money. We're not asking you for gold. We're not asking you for Bitcoin. Those dollars are declining in value as days go by, especially if you've seen the news that the petrodollar is ending. I don't know how much those Federal Reserve notes are going to be retaining value for you so much for very long. So go to porcfest.com/tickets. And for just $29, you can have access to the live stream of the main stage at PorcFest. And if you think it is an incredible value, because it is, you can also throw in a tip for everyone at the Free State Project. Okay, that's the promo. So today, I'm really excited for our guest today. He is a friend of mine, an expert in foreign policy. I think when I think of like who in the liberty movement is the expert on foreign policy to go to understand the crazy events that are going on in this world, it's always our guest today, Scott Horton. Now, who is Scott Horton? He is the editorial director of Antiwar.com. He is the director of the Libertarian Institute. He's also an author of multiple books on foreign policy. Two of them I have actually with me right now. Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, which I've read thoroughly, if you can tell by how pockmarked this book is and bent and creased it is. And also another one I have here, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. This one I was just looking at, and oh yeah, there's a nice little insert on the inside. Airic, for peace, Scott Horton. So I got this personally signed by the man himself. Anyway, I'm so excited to have on the show with us today, Scott Horton. Scott, welcome to the Porcupine Report.
Thanks very much, Airic. How you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. And I do want to preface this conversation because I know how quickly things can move in, especially these days, in kind of global events. So hopefully we're recording this almost a week ahead of time because this is going to air of Wednesday in the middle of PorcFest. So hopefully by that time we have not been nuked and the world has not entered World War III. But you don't know that we just got word of submarines in our hemisphere. I think Vladimir Putin telling us, you putting stuff in our backyard, we can put stuff in your backyard. So who knows how things might escalate there. But we're going to be talking about, Scott, you're literally writing the book right now on Russia and Ukraine and events going on there. So we'll talk about that and anything else that we care to talk about as far as the state of our world. So it's good to have you, man.
Well, thanks for having me. sorry, I'm not going to be able to make it to Pork Fest. I've had a really good time the last few years, but I just had turned down everything other than the Libertarian state and national conventions, which that's business, but otherwise I've turned every other event down, including Freedom Fest and all the other state party conventions and all the other places I've been invited, because I'm just trying to knock this dang book out. It's more than a year overdue. And
Well,
so I'm just focusing on that. And plus, Martha Bueno, was she going to give a speech about why we ought to invade Cuba?
she's actually, we just had her on last week. She's actually going to be talking about why we need to free Ross Ulbricht. So that's something we can all get behind, right?
Yeah. All right. I'll compromise with you on that. She's terrible. Anyway, no, I love Pork Fest. I love all you guys, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be there, but next year I definitely will.
Well, I know it is a loss for you, because I know I talked to you about if you could come out and join us for the New Hampshire Liberty Forum earlier this year, and you said, no, I'm working on the book. Sorry, I can't make it, but Pork Fest, I'll definitely be there for Pork Fest. And then it came time for Pork Fest. It's like, man, I know how much you look forward to Pork Fest. I know I've seen you there multiple years, and
yeah, it's great.
It's a loss for everyone that you won't be there. But hopefully, it means that we'll get your book before the end of the world.
Well, the news is I got up to 1,400 pages and 5,200 something footnotes, and now I'm cutting, and I'm back down to about a little over 1,200 pages now. I'm making progress. I'm cutting out all the block quotes and making them regular quotes and trying to delete as much of them as I can. And then, I still have a lot of editing and writing to do, but I essentially put down all my books and knocked out all my tabs, and I'm trying to just wrap up what I have instead of continuing to learn stuff to tell you. So, I don't know. The goal is to have it done by the end of the year.
What I say, work of art is done not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. So,
oh, there you go. Yeah. So, I want to have it out by the end of the year, not just done by the end of the year. I want to have it done by the end of the summer, although I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely working on it all day, every day.
Well, it certainly seems like if there was any concern that it would stop being timely by the time you publish this book, it certainly seems like the neocons and the neoliberals are doing everything they can to stretch out this conflict indefinitely.
Well, I'd be happy to have a section about how the war ended, and that'd be just perfectly fine with me. And the overall topic of the Cold War with Russia is still going to be an issue no matter what. But hey, Ukrainians and Russians, don't you wait on me to call this thing off. You could end this thing right now, man. I'll get the damn book done. Forget that.
So let's hop right in. I was just having I was just on another podcast with David Feit the other day, and we were talking about how, some frustrations with, within the liberty movement. Most people, I think these days, partly because of the influence of the Ron Paul wing of the liberty movement, most people seem to be in agreement that the U.S. empire is not a force for liberty in the world and not something we should be cheerleading and celebrating, and is in fact provoking unnecessary wars. And that's something that we need to be calling out. There are still a few people, though, sometimes it's frustrating to hear some people in certain, I think they're a minority in the liberty movement, but who seem to repeat talking points from Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and John McCain. Well, I guess John McCain doesn't issue any more talking points these days, but Lindsey Graham certainly does on these issues.
I would dispute that a majority is the right term for it. This is the universal consensus in the libertarian movement is for non-interventionism. And you might be able to name 4 or 5 individuals that are the exception to that rule, but there's nothing like the liberventionist movement that existed 20 years ago, rationalizing going into Iraq, where the best guys got fired from Cato, where Reason Magazine was running, geez, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, by Ron Bailey and Kathy Young and all these horrible people. Kathy Young still exists. But Bailey, I think, apologized for his support for the war, sincerely. They're boy, that was stupid. So the R.J. Rummel, the democide scholar, had supported the war. There were quite a few who were they called them the liberventionists back then. But they don't exist now. Josh Eakel at the Students for Liberty, he's not the leader of anyone. He's just a flunky at an organization. But there are no Eakelites out there demanding America's support for NATO and Ukraine in the name of libertarianism. Not more than you could count on one hand, right? Not more than just a couple of losers on Twitter. But as far as have any influence whatsoever at the Foundation for Economic Education or Mises or the Independent Institute or the Libertarian Institute or with any of the 100,000 angry bearded young men on Facebook and Twitter or whatever it is. Like, they just have nothing to do with our movement at all. They don't represent us at all. And in fact, even at the Libertarian Party convention, where, you know, you can find wishy-washiness from time to time. And, you know, it was only a few years ago, they nominated Bill Weld to be VP to Gary Johnson there. Everyone up on the stage was competing for being who can be the most anti-war, including, you know, the Mises Caucus guy and also his biggest competition who won. Although the vice president is kind of a wishy-washy Zionist type. Once you make a deal with Zionism, now you got to be bad on Iran. Now you got to be bad on Hezbollah and all kinds of crap. So that guy, Mike Termat, he's a bad guy, but nobody cares what he says anyway. Again, I mean, even if you look at the nominee of the Libertarian Party, and he is solid on war, and he's a bit, Chase Oliver has been a big supporter of Defend the Guard and all that. I give him credit. But whether he is or he isn't, he doesn't have the influence anyway. So like, even if he was with like the real, like the very small cadre of pro-interventionist libertarians that you might be able to find there, that would all evaporate in 6 months anyway. You know, the libertarian movement belongs to Dave Smith and Tom Woods and Ron Paul, Antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute and the Foundation for Economic Education, the Independent Institute. I think there's like one kook at the Independent Institute, but they're basically sound. They got Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall. In fact, they just put out this book, Coyne and Hall, How to Run Wars. And of course it's Quit. You know, I haven't read the thing yet, but I know they're both sound on everything. They're both great.
Well,
So,
you know, I
movement, you know, and in fact, you could even say Coyne and Hall, they're more like academic type, professional establishment types compared to say some of me and my crew at the Libertarian Institute, but still they're hardcore. They're 100% non-interventionists. You know what I mean? This is not a book of excuses.
Yeah.
So I would say it's the universal consensus in our movement.
Well, and certainly I think kind of one of the great lessons that I think Ron Paul taught the liberty movement first, and I think the conservative movement has started to grapple with in recent years, is that when our government says that this just came out of the blue and this thing was unprovoked and we were just minding our own business, not doing anything to anyone. I mean, Ron Paul was the one who taught us what blowback is and taught us that when the government is telling you they just were minding their own business, you really need to look at that and ask some questions, because certainly, you know, fool me once. I got fooled. A lot of us got fooled after the 9/11 attacks. We just thought, wow, this just came out of nowhere. It's like, well, you know, we weren't paying attention to what our government was doing in the Middle East. But certainly the people who live there were pretty upset about it. And
well, I got to tell you, look, 9/11 didn't catch me by surprise. And part of the reason was because I was already paying attention to Ron Paul starting in 1997. And Ron Paul had predicted 9/11. Yeah. So as long as we're bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi, we're stirring up these crazies. And there's a real danger here. Even the Saudi government is warning us that we're driving their extremists to extremes. And we ought to knock this off and we ought to get out of there now. When Bill Clinton was being impeached in 1998, Ron Paul said, I'm voting for all 4 articles of impeachment, but I would rather vote to impeach him for bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi. This is going to cause terrorism. And, you know, you check me, it's on C-SPAN. Ron Paul, 1998, December 1998, talking about impeaching Bill Clinton. And he turns it into an anti-war thing, warning that it's going to cause terrorism. Well, guess who is also absolutely perfect on Ukraine for the last 20 years, Eric? The great Ron Paul, of course. And you know, to a great degree, credit also to Dan McAdams, his right-hand man, his foreign policy advisor and expert, who is, you know, there's no one who compares to him or compares, but there's no one better than him on the color-coded revolutions in the world, on how America, through USAID and the NED and working with Soros organizations, do these fake revolutions that are really coup d'etats dressed up as revolutions to overthrow any government that's friendly to Russia. And so Ron Paul warned against this during the Orange Revolution in 2004. He warned against it during the Maidan Revolution in 2014. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a famous clip of when Matt Welch and Kennedy did their show together on Fox Business. And Kennedy asks Ron Paul, what is all this that you're saying about there's a coup going on in Ukraine? And he goes, I'm saying it because there is a coup going on in Ukraine. Look out for it and look for the blowback. Look for the consequences to come from it. This is 10 years ago, 10 and a half. And then 2 days later, they overthrew the government. That was on, you check me, that was on February the 20th. And the government was overthrown by the 22nd.
Yeah, and Victoria Nuland and John McCain and Lindsey Graham just happened to be over there, like serving pancakes to people or something.
Yeah, passing out cookies and letting them know, supporting and sandwiches, and letting them know that America was on their side and supporting them and in fact working with factions inside their intelligence services against their country to overthrow their elected leader.
So hopefully our audience knows enough to understand that this was not an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia. No. Whatever you think about the Russians doing the invasion, right? I think that certainly there's a lot to criticize Russia for, their actions, but to say that it was unprovoked, it really takes two to tango, and we've been at the dance for a while.
It's a perfect parallel, Eric, with bin Laden. When Ron Paul says that Bill Clinton bombed Iraq from bases in Saudi, and that's what provoked anti-American terrorism, nobody thinks Ron Paul is rationalizing or apologizing for what bin Laden did. There are a couple of, dishonest warmongers who tried to pretend that that was what he was saying, but that wasn't what he was saying. He was just saying, look, Bill Clinton picked a fight and got a bunch of New Yorkers into it. And that's what happened. The same thing here. It's not to say that like, oh, you have to now like be on the Russian side of the argument to say that Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and yes, Donald Trump and Joe Biden and throw in John McCain, throwing Biden's entire career in there and John McCain as well. They provoked this war. That's exactly what they did. Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was obviously, a prime mover in the Obama and Biden governments in essentially putting Vladimir Putin's back up against the wall. Now, you might argue that he wasn't all the way in the corner, but you know what? You put a guy's back up against the wall, he might not wait until you got him all the way in the corner. You know what I mean? And they did do it. And look, I'm publishing a book. I just told you my book is 1,400 pages. The reason why is because it's 1,400 pages of quotes of people in charge admitting that I'm right. That's what the book is. It's nothing but footnotes of all of them going, well, what really happened here was we did it. Yeah, of course they did. I mean, isn't the entire narrative that everybody knows, right? Like your dad and your Uncle Bob and everybody understands. We won the Cold War. The Soviet Union not only lost it, but ceased to exist. That the Russian Federation is the powerless rump state left over after the fall of Soviet Empire. We're number one, the superpower, the hyperpower. Everybody knows that. Well, so what does that tell you? That Russia's encroaching in our sphere of influence or we're encroaching in theirs? Simple as that. The sphere is our sphere of influence. Theirs is inside their borders only, and only then if they're lucky. And that's the policy. And so America has pushed it and pushed it and pushed it until they fought us.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I don't think James Monroe ever imagined our Monroe Doctrine was going to extend all the way to Eastern Europe on the edge of.
Look, people should read it. I mean, you can pull up the speech in the Monroe Doctrine. He says, you stay out of the Western Hemisphere and we will stay out of Europe. That's the bargain. We will leave you alone, but you better leave us alone.
So now let me ask you, one of the figures in all of this who seems to have been, I mean, in some ways, I wonder sometimes if people give him a lot more agency than he deserves, which is the president of Ukraine. What's his name? The actor Zelensky. Yes. So you go back to when this first began, and he seemed very open to trying to, sign a peace deal with Putin to avoid this. Of course, I think as you've spoken about extensively, it was the Biden administration and Great Britain that told him, no, don't sign any peace deal, don't negotiate. We got your back no matter what. And now he seems to be the one who, I guess maybe because he got sold a false bill of goods, and now the U.S. and the UK are potentially kind of reneging on this guarantee they gave him. I mean, how do you view him as a figure in the midst of all of this?
Well, a lot of people who are non-interventionists or against intervening in this war seem to like really, I don't know, sometimes demonize him, but don't give him any credit. I personally don't really see anything that bad about the guy for the circumstance that he's in. He's representing people. Well, depends who all he's representing, but there are a lot of Ukrainians who want to fight, and he is, representing them in their interests and trying to organize this and trying to keep the West serving him and supplying him with money and weapons and all that, and he's supplying the guys for the fight. So I can't really blame him for what he's doing, but the whole point is the U.S. should tell him tough. And the U.S. really got him into this mess. I mean, when you say that he wanted to make peace, at first I thought you meant in 2019 when he was first elected, because you're right about that too, right? When he was first elected, that was how he was elected, was his predecessor, Poroshenko, had failed to make peace and had failed to implement the Minsk II deal and solve the problem. And so he originally had signed on to a deal that had been proposed by the Germans it was sort of like extra steps for how to really implement the Minsk II deal. And it came down to the question of holding elections before or after the Russian troops are out of the way and that kind of thing. And essentially he was going for it. And then the radical right wing, including like avowed Hitler-loving Nazis, threatened to murder him. They held these massive rallies called the No to Capitulation rallies. And they said, look, man, if you sign this deal, you'll be hanging from a tree. Simple as that. We overthrew the government before, we'll do it again. And he backed down. And at that point, the Russia scholar Stephen Cohen had said in an interview with Aaron Mate that all this guy needs is a little bit of support from his friends, the Americans, and he can arrest the leaders of these radical right-wing groups who are threatening him and essentially neutralize that threat and go on about politics. But the thing is, the Americans and the Brits and the rest, as you say here, they had common cause. They're strategic allies with these Nazis. They agreed with these Nazis. No to capitulation. We don't want to sign the peace deal, even back in 2019. And now we know from Zelensky, from his predecessor, Poroshenko, and also from Angela Merkel, from Germany, and Francois Hollande from France, they have all said that they never meant to implement the Minsk II deal. They were just biding their time so that they could rearm and prepare for the next phase of the war. And that was why they never implemented the Minsk deal, which had been signed in February of 2015. And they didn't implement it because it was the consensus in Kiev and in DC and in London and the rest that we're going to get this thing back going again as soon as we can, or at least we're going to arm you up for when it kicks off again, which of course it was sure to, as long as they never implemented the deal. And so then, of course, 21 rolls around and Joe Biden spends a year sticking his finger in the eye of Vladimir Putin and having the State Department and Defense Department re-announce their intention, and NATO to re-announce their intention to bring Ukraine into NATO. And then when Putin proposed a reasonable treaty, now, and I talked to real experts about this, like Chas Freeman, who had gone to China with Nixon and had been the ambassador to Saudi Arabia and had been on the National Intelligence Council and was like, a career foreign service guy. He said, look, you wouldn't want to sign on the dotted line. I wouldn't say, Mr. President, just sign the Russians treaty. However, it was the reasonable basis for a discussion. Right? It wasn't like some crazy thing full of outrageous demands that was made to fail, like Madeleine Albright trying to start the Serbian war in 99. It wasn't like that. It was a reasonable basis to negotiate, and Biden refused to negotiate with them in good faith. And they complained about it, and they pressured, and they worked for months. And the Biden administration clearly had a policy that they would rather see a fight break out. And I had missed this until after the war began. I guess maybe I had seen a note, like a hint of this, but I went back and found a bunch of quotes. I mean, a ton of research about how they had said over and over, we want to lure Russia in and replicate the 1980s Afghan war. And that conception, they thought the Russians would almost immediately destroy the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian military. And then they would resort to insurgency. The plan was to essentially back a Nazi-led insurgency against the Russians all along. Plan B was, oh, hey, The state stood, the army stood. The Russians did not come in with everything they had. They came in with a more limited operation. The state of Ukraine was not smashed. We went back an actual army at war instead of just an insurgency. And so they've done that. My worry is that if the Ukrainian army really breaks, they'll just go back to plan A. And seriously, Eric, rewind yourself back to the very beginning of 2022. We'd just gotten beaten and withdrawn from Afghanistan 3 months before. Right. Yeah. In September was, the end of August, beginning of September of 21 was when America finally left Afghanistan, as I had predicted in that book you just held up there 4 years before. The Taliban just walked right into Kabul like it was the fall of Saigon, only easier. And America had to flee. And within 3 months, 4 months, they're citing, even within 2 months, they're citing this as the model. This is what they want to do in Ukraine. And that was why they refused to negotiate in good faith to prevent the war. And then, as you were discussing there, a couple of months into the war, because it really started kind of the end of February, well, right into March and April, they were negotiating. And it was under pressure from the Americans and the British that they gave up the negotiations and decided that because they thought they had done so well in the initial defense, that, oh, great, we got them on their heels. We got them on the ropes now, which was totally an exaggeration. But they convinced themselves, we got them on the ropes now. We're going to keep at it. And we're going to deliver a strategic defeat onto Russia. We're going to kill a bunch of their guys. We're going to force them to waste a bunch of money. We're going to wage this massive economic war against them. And it's going to break Russia. It's going to destabilize the government. And as so many of them fantasized, and lead to the fall of Vladimir Putin and his replacement by, pro-American sock puppets. Yeah, right. Now here we are 2.5 years later. You got something like 100,000 dead and probably 2 or 3 times that injured on both sides. And the more time goes on, the more land Russia takes. And just as was so obvious in real time in the fall of 22 was the high water mark for Ukraine's defense, where they had taken all of Kharkiv province and some of Luhansk province, some of the north of Luhansk province. And at that time, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said, hey, you guys should negotiate now. You're never going to be in a position of strength, but this is the best position of weakness that you could hope for. So you need to just take what you've got and come to the table and make a deal. And he was shouted down by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and Anthony Lake, the Secretary of State, told the 4-star general, you don't know what you're talking about. We know what we're doing with this war. And then after that, they launched the massive failed escalation of 2023. And then it's been all momentum on the Russian side ever since then. They've taken, I guess, 2 or 3 major cities and tens of smaller villages. And only recently they've taken further land around the city of Kharkiv, because the Americans see in the Ukrainians' desperation, the Americans are giving them permission to essentially lash out. As their forces are driven back, they're now just hitting targets with missiles inside Russia, but to not even really any tactical effect, much less any real strategic change on Russia's part. Like, they're not really destroying any Russian military formations or destroying any armament capacity or anything like that. All they're doing is just enraging the Hornets, right? All they're doing is just crossing the line and driving the Russians to more drastic action, especially including lately what they've done is they've now carved out this new area around Kharkiv that they're calling a buffer zone, a sanitary zone. In other words, pushing Ukrainian rocket artillery further back to keep them from attacking inside Russia. So, the Americans, you could hear this over and over, Eric. I'm sure you have seen this, where they essentially say, well, they haven't nuked us yet. Yeah. We keep escalating. We said we wouldn't send tanks, or we wouldn't send HIMARS, or we wouldn't send ATACMS, or we wouldn't send this or that kind of weapon system. And then we did. And they haven't nuked us yet. But you know what? Every time they've escalated the war, in fact, the Russians have escalated back. No, they haven't used nuclear weapons yet. But when the Americans helped them attack the Kerch Bridge, that was when they started bombing civilian infrastructure, blowing up the electricity and all of that kind of thing. And, taking out, worse than that, attacking civilian targets inside Kiev and in Odessa and all over the country. in revenge for those kind of escalations. So essentially the situation is, whether people want to hear it or not, it's the same thing with the Russians in the place of the Taliban. They're going to win this war. You can call it quits now, Barack Obama, in 2010, or you can wait until you Joe Biden in 2021 and lose the same damn war, only another, 75,000 dead people later. And
So
that was what it happened in the last war. Sometimes America loses wars. Okay, always we lose wars, and we have to eventually admit it and go. And that's the situation here. America should be pressuring Ukraine to go to the table and make a deal. Putin quite obviously doesn't want all of Ukraine. He just wants the very most pro-Russian parts of the Far East, Donbass region, and now Kharkiv and Kherson and the so-called land bridge all the way to Crimea. No, I always forget how to pronounce it. New Russia, right? That Catherine the Great had taken. It's not all of Ukraine. It's that sort of eastern crescent of Ukraine down to the Crimean Peninsula. And like, those are the facts of life. They're not driving the Russians out of there. They should make a deal now before it's worse.
Now, let me ask you, so I try to understand a little bit on the side of the West. I mean, what is motivating this? Because certainly if it was just the military industrial complex making money, I mean, they had that self-licking ice cream cone in Afghanistan and the Middle East for the last 20 years. And all of the weapons of mass destruction were fictional, whereas the weapons of mass destruction with Russia are actually real and something to be concerned about. So if it was just profit making for the military industrial complex, they had their playground of terror in the Middle East that they were doing. And they were making bank there. So, but I know I saw Lindsey Graham recently on some interview somewhere. He was talking about, like, we can't let the Russians have the mineral deposits in Ukraine, and we want to secure those mineral deposits. What certainly is a far flung from talks about democracy and freedom, and I guess that was the same rhetoric we heard about invading Iraq and the Middle East, and it turns out that was a war for oil. Is this like just a war for resources that our government has provoked this conflict, or is it a more of a psychological, like what Carthage was to the Romans? It's just that ancient enemy that you just, as long as they're on the map, you can't rest until they're just wiped off. Like, what is driving this? What is driving the craziness from our leaders?
Yeah, well, look, I think that is part of it, that essentially all the people in charge are all old, and they're all old Cold Warriors, and they can't separate out Russia from the Soviet Union. And they can't abide the fact that Vladimir Putin has declared independence from them. I don't know how familiar people are with this history, but Putin came to power as the chosen sock puppet of Boris Yeltsin, America's guy. And he got the job because he had done such a great job essentially covering for them and protecting them from prosecution, helping them get their money out of the country. He had been was perceived as the puppet of the oligarch Boris Berezovsky, who had been extremely close to Yeltsin. But once he got in power, he was like, well, who's the czar now? And immediately, and people, in fact, there's a great quote of Michael McFaul, who later was Obama's ambassador to Russia, talking about how everyone really kind of thought that this was going to be this oligarch-run kleptocratic state, and that Putin was showing them that absolutely not. He was boss as chief executive. And within months of taking power, he let the oligarchs know, you're either going to serve me and keep your mouth shut and stay out of politics, or you better run like hell because I'm coming for you. And a lot of them ran to Tel Aviv, to London, to New York, and took off. Berezovsky's right-hand man, Abramovich, is one of the richest people in the world right now because he stayed and he made his peace with Putin. Whatever you say, boss, just let me keep my interests. And so Putin essentially kicked out all the independent oligarchs and all the oligarchs who would have tried to lord it over him, and made sure that he was the unquestioned boss of the state. And at that point, he, kicked Shell Oil out of Siberia and essentially, made sure that his guys were really in charge, and soft declared independence from the United States. And that was like in the year 2000. That was his first year in power. as America's electing W. Bush that year, and so essentially the century started out with, as so many people had predicted, partially because of all of America's provocations and expanding NATO, especially, that this led to the nationalist right coming to power. And it could be a lot worse. I mean, Putin essentially is a conservative, not a right winger, like a real right winger. And there are real right wingers in that country. He's essentially a center right guy. Justin at Antiwar.com, Justin Raimondo, I remember got in so much trouble in like 03 or 04. He wrote an article called Putin the Patriot. And it wasn't about what he was an American patriot or how any of this was about being good for America. It was, why do they hate him so much? They hate him so much because he's not their puppet. He's his own guy, and he's the sovereign of this powerful hydrogen bomb armed state. And what are you going to do about it? It's the biggest country in the world, and DC cannot dominate it as long as he's there. So they just absolutely despise him. And, as I said, and as I'm sure people remember this phrase, strategic defeat. Oh, we got him now. We are going to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. No matter what they do, no matter how long this war takes, it will end in a strategic defeat for Russia. And after all, we're the ones with the gazillion-dollar economy, while their economy is the same as Italy's. And so we will outlast them. We will outspend them. And we will drive their army into the ground, as Lindsey Graham, who you love to quote, loves to say, we'll kill Russians. We'll kill them, make them dead. And that'll teach them. And then, as they said, and then he'll never try this again. And then he'll never threaten the Baltics. And then he'll never, see, they're all putting all these motivations on him. Like, oh yeah, if it wasn't for us doing this now, he'd be on his way to Warsaw. But it's just not true. I mean, what happened was America essentially fomented this war inside Ukraine, which we should have left neutral, which is a very divided country. And when they voted wrong, we overthrew their government twice in 10 years to make sure that the right guy was in there to do the wrong thing, to start a horrible civil war. And you can blame the Russians for their part in sort of helping to divide the East away from Kiev after the coup of 2014. But John Brennan, the CIA director, aka Barack Obama, went to Kiev and told them, start the war. And then 2 days later was when the real airstrikes campaign, the bombing campaign, began. Like, imagine if there was some coup where the Yankees all take over in Washington. So down here in Texas, everybody occupies buildings and says, well, we don't recognize the federal government anymore. And then the Democratic president just started bombing Texas. Right? We're not negotiating with you. We're not, we're not going to figure out a way to solve this. We're calling in airstrikes on Dallas and Houston and Austin and San Antonio. What do you think would happen? It would be a war. And that's what they've done at America's hands, forced this issue.
Yeah. And as we discussed the last time I was on your show, I mean, I remember in 2016, I was on the Republican National Platform Committee and
oh yeah, you're in my book.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm looking forward to that mention you promised me, right? And I'm on the National Security Subcommittee. I mostly went there because I wanted to push back against kind of neoconservative stuff like, going on in the Middle East. But I open it up and I'm like, there's this whole section here about we support giving weapons to Ukrainians in I don't remember the exact verbiage, but basically giving weapons to Ukrainians in the civil war, specifically to fight and kill Russians. Right. And I'm just thinking this is a bad idea. Why would we articulate this in our platform that we're, I just was thinking about how all the work that Ronald Reagan did to try to have a peaceful end to this Cold War and to stay out of a hot war with this nuclear armed power. Like, why are we going to put such provocative language in our platform saying that we're just inserting ourselves in this civil war halfway around the world? And Of course, that led to a huge fight at the on the platform committee. Someone representing the Trump campaign said, "Yeah, maybe we actually do need to soften this language," and they took out the whole piece about lethal arms. So now we're just going to give aid, even though Trump did go on to give lethal arms to try to prove how not a puppet of Vladimir Putin he was. And of course, that led to it became a whole centerpiece in the whole the Russiagate evidence that he was bought and paid for by Vladimir Putin, that he wanted to take out the provision, or his campaign agreed to take out the provision saying we're going to give lethal arms to Ukrainians in this civil war. So this has been brewing for a long time. And I know that some people just woke up when the invasion happened and thought, wow, this was unprovoked, came from nowhere. And the media tells us over and over again, it was unprovoked. How do we, what are the off ramps at this point? Because it seems to continue to escalate. Our government, at least the folks currently in charge of our government, both the elected and unelected officials, seem to have no interest in de-escalating and looking for an off ramp. Maybe a change in administration might certainly maybe change some elements and all that, though it's hard to say with any certainty how that would look. Now we have Putin putting submarines in our off our coast just to let us know that he can.
Well, look, the answer is that Putin has been offering to negotiate again, basically for the last 6 months or more, dating to the end of last year. He said repeatedly that, look, we should have some talks. And they just did a big special report in Reuters, I'm going to say like 2 weeks ago, where it was like, 5 important Russian sources came to Reuters and said, Putin is willing to essentially accept your surrender now, right? He's not going to negotiate. He's not going to retreat 1 inch, but he's willing to settle for everything he's gotten so far. And like I say, Mark Milley said in the fall, end of October of 22, he said, this is as good as it gets, boys. They had this successful push in Kharkiv province and in northern Luhansk. And he said, this is it, dude. You should go to the table right now. This is the closest to a position of strength you're going to get. This is the strongest position of weakness that you're going to be in for the rest of the history of this war. Take what you can get. And they said no and continued to push on. So Putin is not willing to compromise, but he is willing to stop the war. Yeah. And so it's sort of like if it was 2012 and the Taliban said, listen, just give us Nangarhar and Kandahar and Helmand province, and then we'll quit. But you guys can keep Kunduz, and you guys can keep, near Kabul in that area. Take the deal. You don't take the deal, they're going to eventually conquer the whole damn country. You're better off just taking the deal as it is now. Right now, I think, look, Putin does not want the whole damn country, but he might decide to go ahead and take Kharkiv and Odessa. And the Ukrainians are just in no position to stop him. And the only reason that he's not doing it is because he would rather just grind them down by letting them try to attack him, and they lose troops at a ratio of 3-1 compared to his guys defending the territory that they've already taken. Why throw guys away on an offense until you're done further weakening the Ukrainian defense? But still, the Russians are in the position of strength. So I know it does suck. Like, whatever. I know there are a lot of Ukrainian patriots who are not a bunch of Nazis. There are Nazis there, but not everyone there. Not anywhere near the majority of people fighting in the war are Nazis. There are plenty of just plain old great Ukrainian patriots who fought and bled and died in this thing to try to defend their country. Tough. George Bush and Barack Obama got a bunch of Tajiks and Uzbeks killed fighting the Pashtuns too. And that's just the sunk cost fallacy. And would anybody argue that after sacrificing so many Tajik lives fighting the Pashtuns, we have to go back to Afghanistan now so that it wasn't all in vain? It was in vain. It was all in vain. George Bush and Barack Obama, they should have never done that. And Donald Trump, he should have got us out of that war the moment he was sworn in instead of 4 years later. But still, it was all in vain. So yes, it sucks. But that's the answer, is there's an off-ramp right here. Except that you already lost Novorissa, Russia, or wherever they pronounce it, the far eastern parts of Russia, including Crimea there. And then as far as the ships in the Russian ships over here, I mean, that's nothing. They sent a couple of battleships over. There's nothing like an attack force there, nothing like the kind of force required to challenge the American Navy in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the truth is that, I mean, they have subs and ships in the Atlantic all the time, and they could target America's major cities on the eastern seaboard with hypersonic weapons at any time. And in fact, you know, the New York Times says they were practicing that. They were doing drills, practicing hitting us with hypersonics on their way to Cuba. But the same article in the New York Times is full of quotes from admirals at the Pentagon saying, this is nothing, dude. We sail our ships all around the world all the time, too. It's international waters. They have every right to sail to Cuba and back. This is nothing like an offensive threat to us. There's no reason to think those ships have nuclear weapons on board or anything like that, right? It's just a little bit of strutting is all it is. It's not any kind of practical threat to the United States whatsoever. So people should not be afraid about that.
Well, let me ask you, so hypothetically, let's say Joe Biden or whoever is really the president woke up tomorrow and said, all right, we need to come to the negotiating table. We need to end this war. And they took kind of the deal that's on the table right now, or at least some version approximating that. What happens after that? I mean, at this point in time, with the areas that the Russians have taken, you've got so presumably, I don't know the geography of the area like you do, but I presume that includes all of the pro-Russian areas in Ukraine, leaving Western Ukraine kind of intact. Now Russia has kind of a buffer zone between Western Ukraine and kind of inner Russia in Moscow, which I think is primarily what they concern. If at that point, like Western Ukraine, obviously I would not prefer that they didn't, but let's say NATO said, okay, well, we're taking what remains of Ukraine and they're coming into NATO and they're joining the European Union. Does that kind of start this conflict all over again, or does I mean, because obviously you don't have the democratic balance between the pro-West and the pro-Russian Ukrainians.
That's right.
Like you had for all this time.
Hey, did you read a copy of my book before I put it out? Did I send you one to review?
No, I haven't, but I listen to your podcast pretty regularly, Scott.
Oh, that's good. Yes, no, you're right. This is at absolute best. This is a Pyrrhic victory for Russia. Because look at what happened. They had a country that was basically divided 50-50 with people who usually, if there was an election, the Russian leading candidate won. Now, and look, it's true that America kept canceling the elections and started a civil war over it, and they had reason to be fed up. But now what? Now they've essentially kidnapped, whether they like it or not, the entire pro-Russian population of the country into their own country, which has left behind a rump Ukrainian state that is full of everyone who hates them and who have the hardest feelings against them now than they ever have since the Holodomor or whatever, right? It's been this long, or at least since the fall of the Soviet Union. And in fact, with a lot of extremely right-wing, even neo-Nazi forces in leadership positions and in powerful positions there in the military and in the security services and so forth. And then, now the Russians got to deal with that from now on. And then the question is, what do the Americans do with that? We really going to invite them into NATO? We're really going to bring in a Ukraine that is, eminently hostile to Russia, that now has no, as you put it, like kind of democratic moderating force to compromise on these issues whatsoever, and bring in, I think you can say about all these Eastern European countries that they're all very fearful of Russia. They've been subject to the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union for many centuries, but they're not all like chomping at the bit to fight them. They're afraid to fight them. You know what I mean? Whereas like the Ukrainians they want to fight. At least the people in charge, they want to fight, and they're willing to do the kinds of things to provoke a worse fight if it can draw us in. And this is the kind of thing that real danger of entangling alliances is, well, for example, like I was talking about, what is the point of getting these new longer range HIMARS and ATACMS rockets and attacking into Russia other than because it doesn't achieve anything strategically other than provoking Russia into then escalating the war in response. And what's the purpose of that? Why would Ukraine want to do that? Only one reason: so that they can say to the Americans, help more. Look at how bad it is, right? We saw this, for example, in Bosnia, where the Bosnian Muslims knew that Bill Clinton favored them. And so they would put themselves in compromising positions to get killed in large numbers all the time, and sometimes even resort to blowing up their own people in the marketplace, just so that they could say to Bill Clinton, please help us against the Serbs, which in fact did work. And after the second big false flag at the marketplace was what provoked Bill Clinton's big air campaign in the summer of 95 that, then led to the Dayton Accords shortly after that. So this is the kind of thing that can happen is, we by giving a war guarantee to people, we essentially outsource our choices to them and let them decide whether to get us into a war. So, I mean, let's say that the Russians really break through and smash the Ukrainian army and roll all the way to Kiev, and then look at Lviv and think, you know what, maybe we'll just roll all the way to Galatia. Who's going to stop us now? Then what does Biden do? Sail our Navy into the Black Sea to fight? Start, sending in the Marine Corps and the Air Force? Or he's just going to sit there and grit his teeth as the Russians march all the way to Moldova and all the way to Poland? And that would be, and look, again, I don't think that the Russians do want to go that far, but that is what they're risking, and so, yeah, I as much as I argue that it's America's fault that Russia invaded, even as much as the Russians, it was the Russians' fault that they invaded as much as it was the Americans for provoking them. And they really shouldn't have done it from their own point of view and their own best interests. There is a better way to handle this than to roll in like this, because they're now, look, why did Lenin draw the border there in the first place? He drew the border there so that the Ukrainians would be diluted by Russians, right? That was why he did it. Okay, now it's 100 years later, and the Russians are redrawing the border to exclude all the Russians from Ukraine, leaving it an almost, not exactly, but a much more purely ethnic Ukrainian state that, where brotherly ties canceled. Whereas before, they were all so intermixed and intertwined together, their two societies.
Yeah.
So it's a real shame for everybody all around. And what's it going to look like in 20 years? I mean, I don't know. This is all a real damn problem. If this is where we are because of the damn Orange Revolution, George Bush's fake coup in 2004, then where are we going to be in another 20 years from now? I don't know, man. It shouldn't, but it doesn't have to be this way. It should not be this way at all. We should have, America could, and just like in Afghanistan, I hate to say it, it's only China hawks who agree with me. We should leave Afghanistan so we can double down in Asia. Same thing here. We should be friends with Russia, not so we can double down in Asia. But that's the only other foreign policy people who agree with me about getting along with Russia is we don't want to push them toward China. We want to split them away from China. And so I would say, look, if those are our two choices, we should split them away from China. But not because we need to have a conflict with China either, you understand? But that's where we're at. And honestly, like, this would be the main lesson of the book when the book finally comes out and you read through the thing. The book is just essentially a giant pile of fair warning that you shouldn't do this. I'm telling you shouldn't do this. We shouldn't be doing this. You know what's going to happen if we do this? I'll tell you what's going to happen. It's going to be just like this. And then that happens over and over and over again from the H.W. Bush years all the way through. It ain't nothing but people refusing to listen and then doing the wrong thing and then going, oh, no, I can't understand why this happened. It's totally unprovoked problem and thing. Now we got to double down for 30 years.
Well, Scott, we could talk about this. I mean, I would love to talk with you about this for another 5 hours because your wealth of knowledge. We are running up against the clock. So I want to give you the final word. Any final message that you think that the audience should know about where we are right now in the state of things and where people can follow you and your show and on social media?
Sure. So Well, look, the most important thing that people need to know is that my guys at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute are doing the best job of anybody in the world on this stuff. And that's especially Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com and Kyle Anzalone at the Institute, but also everybody at antiwar.com and the Institute. And we got nothing but the very best writers. We got all the news and opinion pieces and everything that you need to know about what the hell is going on around here from a non-interventionist, Ron Paulian, Rothbardian libertarian perspective. That's antiwar.com and libertarianinstitute.org. And then my show is called The Scott Horton Show. I've got more than 6,000 interviews going back to 2003 about all of this stuff for you there at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. And then I got all the books. If you go to scotthorton.org, they're all, linked at the top of the page there. Enough Already is really my book about all the Middle East wars from Jimmy Carter all the way through the Trump years there. And then, for now I'm working on my book. It's going to be called Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. And so, keep your eye on the Institute for that. And that should be out by the end of the year, I hope.
Awesome. Scott, thank you so much. And I'm sorry we won't have you at PorcFest this year, but once your book is done, we'll look forward to having you next year.
Great. See you then.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks.
All right, everyone, that's the show. Thank you so much for tuning in for a very both enlightening and disturbing conversation about where we are right now, probably closer to real nuclear war than we've ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So thank you, Joe Biden, for that, and to all the others who've played a role. But hopefully there will be folks who come along who can help be part of the solution there. I do want to mention to you all, again, after the Porcupine Freedom Festival, which is going on right now as this episode comes out, next month in July 10th through the 13th, the Free State Project is going to be at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas, Nevada. And if you would like to go out to Freedom Fest, they're going to have a lot of great speakers, a lot of great people. President of Argentina, Javier Milei, is coming to Freedom Fest. Again, that's July 10th through the 13th. You can get tickets at freedomfest.com, and you can use the code FSP50, a special coupon code just for supporters of the Free State Project, FSP50, to save $50 off the current attendee price for Freedom Fest. So I'm going to be there. They're giving us a great opportunity to be on the main stage for 20 minutes to talk about the great work that's happening with the Free State Project in New Hampshire. We're really looking forward to that. And perhaps I'll see you there, and perhaps you can you'll use that discount code and save $50. All right. So I want to thank our technical producer, Raynita, again, like always, for running things masterfully behind the scenes to give us a high quality show for you every single week. And furthermore, my opinion is, everyone, the Federal Reserve should be destroyed. Thank you very much.